Hi, Diddle Diddle. I scared the little one. Hey, Diddle Diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Storytime with Jocelyn. I read that today because I thought it would be pretty cool because yesterday was the 54th anniversary of when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Do you think they saw the cow jumping over the moon when they were there? Who knows? Well, today's story time, we're going to actually read something in honor of that event in 1969 on July 20th. And it is a book called Look to the Stars. And it is written by the second man to walk on the moon, Buzz Aldrin. Because we know, of course, the first one was Neil Armstrong. Jocelyn and I yesterday watched the movie First Man, which is about the life of Neil Armstrong. And the paintings in this book are by Wendell Minor. So let us begin with Look to the Stars. Since the beginning of time, humans have looked to the moon and the stars with great wonder. Some even dreamed of traveling into space. I know I did. But space travel was still science fiction during my childhood. Only comic book heroes like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers blasted off into space. Going to the moon or Mars was something only they could do, or so we thought. Right, Jocelyn? When I was a boy, I admired my dad's achievements as a pilot. Our house was filled with photos from many of his friends who were among the great aviation pioneers of their time, including a picture of the Wright brothers, signed by Orville White, and a signed picture of Amelia Earhart chastening the two-engine amphibian plane that my dad flew for Standard Oil of New Jersey. I flew in that very plane at the age of 6. My dad's love of flying became my inspiration to look at the stars. 2009 marks the 40th anniversary. That was back then. Of Apollo 11, when Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and I traveled to the moon. Neil and I were the first to walk on its surface. Let's look back to where this journey began and then look forward to where it might lead. Buzz Aldrin. And here is a picture of his dad, Edwin Aldrin Sr. He was a young Army aviator in 1923. That's Buzz Aldrin's daddy. A new view of the universe. When searching the night sky as a boy, I often wondered about the first people to study the stars. When Nicholas Copernicus was a boy, people believed that the Earth was the center of our solar system. Copernicus had a different idea. He said that the Earth was a planet that revolved around the sun. Galileo was the first astronomer to observe the planets through a telescope, and what he saw convinced him that Copernicus was right. He also observed the Earth's moon, Jocelyn, and saw craters and mountains there. German astronomer and scientist Johannes Kepler even dreamed about traveling to the moon. Kepler's laws of motion proved that the orbits of the planets were elliptical, not round. And what about Isaac Newton? He invented the reflecting telescope and advanced the laws of motion and gravity. As strange as it may seem, Newton found that the force causing an apple to fall to the ground is the same force that holds the moon and the planets in their orbits. Wow. It was Newton's theory of gravity that established the basic foundation for advancement in man-powered flight. Here is a picture of Galileo's telescope. And, of course, a picture of Isaac Newton. First of all, we must note that the universe is spherical, and for every action, there is an equal and an opposite reaction. First flights. As boys, Ervil and Wilbur White built kites and dreamed of flying someday. After years of hard work, their dreams came true when these two young bicycle builders from Dayton, Ohio, finally did what no one had ever done before. On a cold and windy morning in December 1903, Orville flew the White Flyer 1, a distance of 120 feet, in 12 seconds. True, that's not a long time, but what an exciting 12 seconds! Then Brother Wilbur took the controls later that day, flying 852 feet in 59 seconds. The heavier the air-flying machine had lifted from the sandy beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and into history. This was the beginning of the aviation era. Charles Lindbergh made history too with the first solo transatlantic flight in 1927. Right, Jocelyn? From Long Island, New York to Paris, France. Wow. His small single-engine plane, Spirit of St. Louis, covered the 3,610 miles in 33.5 hours. The farm boy's dream of flying had become one more giant step for manned flight. In 1969, only 66 years after the Wright brothers' first successful flight of the Wright Flyer 1, Neil Armstrong and I landed on the moon with a piece of fabric from that very same plane. I think Orville and Wilbur would have been pleased and very proud. If birds can glide for long periods of time, then why can't I? Is he alone who has courage on his right hand and faith on his left hand? This is a picture of the Spirit of St. Louis. And of course, the Wright Flyer 1, the Wright brothers' plane. Yeah. Visions of other worlds. I believe you must challenge yourself to think big and believe that anything is possible. Astronomer Edwin Hubble and physics professor Robert Goddard did just that. Edwin Hubble was the first person to discover galaxies beyond our own. He also proved that our universe is constantly expanding. His quest to observe and understand the distant stars was inspired by Jules Verne's 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon, one of my favorites. Young Robert Goddard was also inspired by reading science fiction. As a teenager, he read H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds and dreamed of inventing a machine that would take humans to the moon and to Mars. On a wintry March day in 1926, Goddard successfully launched the first liquid-filled rocket in history. Zoom! Although his rocket flew only 184 feet to an altitude of 41 feet in 2.5 seconds, its launch really signaled the birth of the space age. My dad studied under Dr. Goddard, and I believe his friendships with his teacher and Charles Lindbergh helped advance aviation and space science. Dad arranged a meeting between his two friends, and Lindbergh helped find support for Goddard's research, which set the stage for bigger and better rockets to come. This is a picture of Mount Wilson Observatory. Have you ever been to an observatory to see the big telescopes? You could see a lot of different things. You should go. Just remember, when you think all is lost, the future remains. The great spirals apparently lie outside our stellar system. This is Robert Goddard's first rocket flight at his Aunt Elfie's farm. Breaking new barriers. It amazes me that I have had a good fortune to know and work with many of the great contributors to aviation science and history. As a child, Wernher von Braun wanted to travel to the moon. When he was 18, von Braun joined a rocket society in Berlin to pursue his dream. Years later, he helped develop and launch the V-2 rocket, Vengeance 2, for the German Army in World War II. Applying Dr. Goddard's basic design for liquid fuel propulsion. The V-2 had a speed of 3,500 miles per hour and can travel a distance of 250 miles. After the war, von Braun fled to America, where his V-2 rocket would eventually be developed into the Redstone rocket that put the first American into space. Captain Chuck Yeager, the famous World War II fighter ace, became the first human to break the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 rocket plane. This gigantic sonic boom was a major breakthrough for flight that many thought impossible to achieve. Later, my future Apollo 11 commander, Neil Armstrong, set many speed and altitude records in the hypersonic X-15 research plane, which provided important information for flight above the Earth's atmosphere. Basic research is what I am doing when I don't know what I am doing. Research is creating new knowledge. This is Wendell von Braun. And this, of course, is the V-2 rocket. And here is a picture of Neil Armstrong, the NASA's X-15, and the Bell X rocket plane. What you think, Jocelyn? It's a good book, huh? Messages from space. I first heard the beeps on the radio and somehow knew that the world had changed forever. The small, shiny silver sphere called Sputnik was only about the size of a basketball. It had 4 long antennae that transmitted a beeping radio signal back to Earth. On radios around the world, you could tune in to hear the beeps. It seemed to many people like pure science fiction, but it was far from that. This was the first time a man-made satellite could communicate from space to Earth. Amazing. When the Soviet Union put Sputnik into orbit in 1957, the great space race with the United States was off and running. America successfully launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit in 1958, the very same year that NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was established. That was 1958. Nearly every child in America looked to the night sky to search for the tiny moving stars that were the first satellites. Those satellites inspired a new generation of children to study math and science to prepare for future careers in space exploration. And I know the math is important, but I hate math. We were first. Russian newspaper headline, October 1st, 1957. Congratulations, the road to the stars is now open. Sergei Korolev, father of the Soviet space program. And here is a picture of Sputnik. The first astronauts. They were known as the Mercury 7, and they were really for a bold challenge to break the grip of Earth's gravity and become the first space-traveled pioneers. Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Scalera, and Gordon Cooper and D.K. Slayton were considered heroes, not only by me, but by every science-loving kid in the nation. America was rushing to catch up again with Russia, who had just put the first man in space. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth once in 1961. 23 days after Gagarin's flight, Alan Shepard climbed into the tiny, cramped Mercury 3 capsule, Freedom 7. The spacecraft measured just 6 feet 10 inches in length and 6 feet 3 inches in diameter. It's not very big. Not much bigger than a go-kart. Wiener von Braun's Redstone rocket was to use to launch Freedom 7. Alan Shepard became the first American in space, and although he didn't orbit the Earth, Shepard reached an altitude of over 116 miles during his 15-minute flight. Americans cheered when they heard Mission Control say, "Everything is A-OK." After Shepard's success, President John F. Kennedy challenged America, saying, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. It seemed impossible, and even more impossible, that I would eventually participate in that goal." Here is a picture of Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet Union Russian cosmonaut. That's what they call him over there in Russia. And here's a picture of Alan Shepard and his Freedom 7 capsule. Now you can see, compared to his height, how big this little ship is. I must admit, maybe I am a piece of history after all. I could have gone on flying through space forever. Here is a picture of the Mercury 3 whenever it took off. And of course, you can see the Freedom 7 at the very top. This is the part that you see that was next to Alan Shepard in the other picture. Mercury goes into orbit. In 1962, astronaut John Glenn climbed aboard his Friendship 7 capsule, perched on top of the new Atlas rocket, which was almost five times more powerful than the Redstone. I was one of millions of Americans who watched on television as Glenn blasted off into space. He became the first American to orbit the Earth, not once, but 3 times. It wasn't a snap either. After the first orbit, his autopilot failed, so Glenn had to take over the manual controls for the remaining 2 orbits to complete his mission. This incident proved how important it was to have manual controls in case the autopilot failed. During Project Mercury's final mission, Gordon Cooper spent 34 hours orbiting the Earth and was the first man to spend a night in space. When it was time to return, he too was forced to take over the manual controls since the automated re-entry system wasn't working properly. Cooper piloted his craft in a perfect re-entry. The 6 Mercury missions proved that humans could function in space and return safely. At the time, I was studying astrodynamics and developing orbital rendezvous techniques at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which some people know as MIT. The year after earning my doctorate degree, I was accepted into the 3rd group of NASA astronauts. I felt I was on my way up. Here is a picture of John Glenn boarding the Friendship 7. And this is the re-entry of the Friendship 7. You know, without heat shields, you know how hot they would be and how burned up they would get? I don't know what you could say about a day in which you have seen 4 beautiful sunsets in one day. Speaking of the Mercury 7 astronauts, we're kind of like a bunch of brothers. We're quite close, and they were. The Gemini Bridge to the Moon. I used to call it Gemini. I think it depends on where you come from. But last night's movie we were watching, First Man, they kept saying Gemini. So I don't know if it's the way they said it in the space program is Gemini Or if it's Gemini, who knows? One of the Project Gemini's goals was to keep humans in space for up to 2 weeks, even though the Gemini spacecraft had no more room than 4 seats of a Volkswagen Beetle. Whew. Stay in for 2 weeks in a small cramped car? Think about it. The Gemini astronauts were the first to rendezvous and dock 2 vehicles in space and venture outside of a spacecraft. My friend Ed White and from West Point was the first American to walk in space. The most amazing Gemini mission of all was perhaps Gemini 8, when Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott accomplished the first docking with an unmanned spacecraft. Disaster seemed certain when the 2 joined vehicles began to tumble out of control because of a rocket thruster got stuck in the on position. But Neil managed to undock and manually regain control of their craft and make an emergency landing. By doing this, Neil not only saved the mission, he saved their lives. And that's in the movie if you get a chance to watch it. It's called First Man. I had the privilege of being on board the final Gemini mission, Gemini 12, with my friend Jim Lovell, who you may know as being played by Tom Hanks in Apollo 13. We completed the rendezvous and docking with our target vehicle twice, and I perfected pressure-suited maneuvering techniques while making world record spacewalks, totaling 5 hours and 32 minutes. America's space program was on a roll. We were now ready to shoot for the moon with Project Apollo. And this is astronaut Ed White takes flight in his first spacewalk. Can you imagine what was going through his mind at that time? Just floating, free falling, or not falling, but just free floating up into space. I mean, just reminds me of that song from Frozen 2, Into the Unknown. And this is the Gemini, or the, Gemini capsule scale to the astronauts. So you're going to see the capsule, and then you're going to see how big it is. It's a little bit bigger than, but you can see that by seeing how tall the astronauts are and how the capsule looks. Basically, like a car. So during my spacewalk, I said, "Jim, I'm going to clean your windshield." Jim Lovell responded, "Hey, Buzz, check the oil too, would you?" After the spacewalk, Ed White said, "I felt red, white, and blue all over." Project Apollo and the dream comes true. When Neil Armstrong and I touched down on the moon's surface in the Eagle, we fulfilled President Kennedy's challenge. We had won the race to the moon, and the whole world watched and cheered. Even a science fiction writer like Jules Verne could have not imagined a spaceship taller than a 36-story building, more powerful than 100,000 locomotives, and weighing more than 6 million pounds. Think of it. 6 moon landings in only 4 years. Just 12 men had ever actually walked on the moon. Just 12. And believe me when I say, I am proud to be one of them. Nearly 400,000 dedicated people worked on Project Apollo, and I thank them, one and all. It's no exaggeration to call Apollo the most spectacular scientific triumph of the 20th century. The dreams of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Goddard, and Van Braun, and so many more had finally come true. That's one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind. Beautiful, beautiful, magnificent desolation. Something that he said to Neil on the moon, Buzz Aldrin. Here is a picture of Buzz and Neil on the moon with the Eagle, part of their Apollo 11 spaceship mission. Ooh. And here, I guess, is Buzz, the second man to walk on the moon, to come down from the ladder of the eagle. To be a space pioneer, you have to be willing to risk everything, possibly even your life. Project Apollo began with the tragic loss of my Air Force squadron mate, Ed White, and his crewmates, Roger Chaffee and Gus Grissom. The Apollo 1 capsule fire on Launch Pad 34 in 1967 shocked and saddened all Americans. As a result of that accident, NASA redesigned the Apollo's capsule to ensure the safety of future astronauts. I believe all the Apollo crews that followed owed a debt of gratitude to these courageous men. Amen. The amazing Apollo missions. Here we're going to talk about the different things that each Apollo mission did and what they accomplished. And some eventually, some didn't go through. Some, sometimes there's a number missing and you wonder, what happened on that one? Well, you know what happened on Apollo 1. The 3-stage Saturn V rocket that launched the Apollo missions was a designed marvel created by Wernher von Braun and his NASA team. It was made up of over 3 million parts. And can you think if one of those 3 million parts was gone? The whole mission would... Just one. The first stage engine burned at liftoff, after which the whole stage was discarded, Jocelyn. Then the second and third stages kicked in and were discarded after their fuel was burned. The Apollo spacecraft sat atop this powerful rocket for their historic journeys into space. So we're going to start. Oh, and here, let me show you the Saturn V rocket. It was 363 feet tall. Now, I live in Houston, Texas. So Jocelyn has actually seen a replica, or I don't know if it's a replica or it's the real one. It's one of them, maybe, of a Saturn V rocket. I'm not sure which one it is, but it had to be preserved inside a building. But when I was a little girl, it was outside. And eventually it started to deteriorate. So they had to put it inside because of, they wanted to preserve it. So I think it is a real Saturn V. I'm not sure which one it is, though. I have to go back. It's been a while since I've been to NASA Space Center, Johnson Space Center. But anyways, so yes, there is a Saturn V replica that Jocelyn has seen. I wish I could go and look in my phone and give you a picture of it, but she's got a picture with the Saturn V rocket. So here is the stages and the different things of the Saturn V rocket. Can you see it? And now we're going to talk about different missions. The missions at a glance. You had the Apollo 7, which happened in October of 1968. And it had astronauts Cunningham, Secura, and Excel, the first to man Apollo spacecrafts tested in Earth orbit. First live TV broadcast from space. So the Apollo 7 was the first time that we got to see a broadcast on TV. Or not me, I wasn't alive, but my parents and all that. I got to see it on TV. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Dad if he ever watched it. I can't ask Mom, but that'd be interesting to learn if they were actually watching TV during those times. Especially when Neil Armstrong first walked on the moon. That'd be interesting to hear that story. And then you got Apollo 8, which happened in December of that same year, 1968. And that had Borman, Lovell, and Anders. And that was the first manned flight of the Saturn V rocket. First one. The first manned lunar orbit and the first images of Earth rise over the moon. Live TV broadcast on Christmas Eve. Woo! Merry Christmas. And then on Apollo 9, March 1969, woo! Jocelyn, they came back on your birthday. The astronauts were Miss McDivitt, Scott, and Skarchakart. First manned flight of all lunar hardware in Earth orbit, and the first rendezvous of the lunar module. They had to make sure that a lot of those times that they had to be able to pick it up, and they had to take it to the moon, because that's what land on the moon, the lunar module. And then Apollo 10 happened in May of 1969, and the command module was called, I guess they started calling the command module, they called it a nickname, and then that's when they started calling the lunar module a nickname, because the command was called Charlie Brown, and the lunar was called Snoopy. And the astronauts were Stafford Young and Cernan. And the first dress rehearsal for the moon landing. That was a dress rehearsal, so they didn't really land yet, but it was to see if it's possible. You know, I guess they flew, but they detached, they went back up, you know, but they didn't actually land. And that was the first live color TV broadcast from space. And then you got Apollo 11. And that happened in July. And of course, they landed on the moon July 20th, 1969. And their command module was called the Columbia. And of course, we know the lunar module was called the Eagle. The Eagle has landed. And the astronauts we know as Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin. Michael Collins was the pilot of the command module, so he didn't leave the command module. And that's why Armstrong and Aldrin are the ones that got to walk on the moon. It was the first manned lunar landing in history. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That was what Neil Armstrong said yesterday, 54 years ago. Neil and Buzz collect their first moon rocks. And then you got Apollo 12, which happened in November of 1969. And their command module was the Yankee Clipper. And their lunar lander was called the Intrepid. And that was astronauts Conrad, Gordon, and Bean. 75 pounds of moon material was collected and brought back items from the Surveyor 3 spacecraft. And then you got Apollo 13. Now, if you don't know the story of Apollo 13, there is a movie where Jim Lovell is played by Tom Hanks. And then you got Kevin Bacon, and I forgot the other guy's name, but he was the one from Titanic. But Apollo 13 happened in April of 1970, and the command module, if you watch the movie, you'll hear these names a lot. The command was called the Odyssey, and the lunar lander was called the Aquarius. And the astronauts, of course, were Jim Lovell, Swaggart, and Hayes. And the oxygen tank explosion in the service module aborted the landing mission. The dedication of mission control and the astronauts saved the day. They call it, I'm not reading this from the book, but if you watch the movie, they call it a successful failure, which means they brought the astronauts safe to Earth, but they failed in their mission of landing on the moon. Then you got Apollo 14, which happened in January and February of 1971. And the command module was called the Kitty Hawk. And the lunar lander was called the Antares. And the astronauts were Alan Shepard, Rosa, and Mitchell. And a handcart used for the first time to collect rocks, and 94 pounds of moon material was collected. I've actually touched a piece of a moon rock only because they have an exhibit at NASA. So it's pretty cool. Feels like a rock. And then Apollo 15 happened in July and August of 1971, and their command module was Endeavour, and their lunar lander was Falcon. Their astronauts were Scott, Warden, and Irwin, and their first use of the lunar rover. Do you know what the lunar rover is? It's like a little car driving around on the moon. And they collected 169 pounds of moon material. And then you have Apollo 16, which happened in April of 1972. And their command module was called Casper. And the lunar lander was called the Orion. And the astronauts were Young, Madeley, and Duke, and the first study of the lunar highlands area. And they collected 209 pounds of moon material. And then you got Apollo 17, which started on my birthday. 6 years before, in 1972. But it started in December 7th, and the command module was called America. And the lunar lander was called the Challenger. And the astronauts were Cernan, Evans, and Smith. and the first scientist astronaut to land on the moon. So that was the first time an astronaut who was also a scientist landed on the moon. And they collected 243 pounds of moon material. Here is the service module, the command module, and the lunar module of the Apollo spacecraft. An Apollo spacecraft was made up of 3 separate modules. The command module, which we told you the nicknames of all of the Apollo missions, was the control center and the house to crew of the 3 astronauts. The service module contained the life support systems of the crew, as well as a source of reusable rocket power for the journey. And then the lunar module carried 2 astronauts. You couldn't do 3. That's why one had to stay back with the command module to the moon surface and was housed for launch in the LM adapter, which is the lunar module voyage. And that is the 3 different modules of the Apollo, or of the Saturn V rocket. Houston, Apollo, I've got the world in my window. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life. That was said by Gus Grissom from Apollo 1. We learned to live in space. After all of our successful Apollo missions, NASA turned its attention to the challenges of living in space. Actually, I forgot to show y'all this one picture of the Saturn V taking off. Sorry about that. One of the Apollo missions. Okay, now let me go back. Sorry about that. So after all our successful Apollo missions, NASA turned its attention to the challenges of living in space for long periods of time by launching Skylab, America's first orbiting laboratory, in 1973. 25 years after the launch of Skylab, construction began on the International Space Station. The ISS is the largest research facility ever to be built in space, a permanent orbiting platform where astronauts from many countries learn how to live and work off the planet. It is scheduled to be completed in 2010. That was a while. I guess it was still, when Buzz wrote this, it was still being constructed. Yeah, it's finished. I believe the ISS will continue to be a gateway to new frontiers where scientists can study the effects of weightlessness and conduct experiments to learn how humans might live in space, not for months, but years. This is the original Skylab. And this is astronauts and cosmonauts meeting in space for the first time when an Apollo command module docked with a Russian Snotcraft. That was in 1975. That is really cool. You can see the difference between the two, the Russian spacecraft and the American spacecraft. This is the International Space Station, which is near completion, which now, if you look at pictures of it, it's a lot different than this. It's bigger. In 2010. But this is how it looked then when this book was written. October 2007, 2 women meet in space. Space Shuttle Discovery Commander Pamela Mulroy and ISS Commander Peggy Winson. Space is our frontier, and beginning its exploration may be our generation's greatest contribution to human history. The Space Shuttle. What launches like a rocket and lands like a plane? It's the Space Shuttle, of course, which now is retired. It is the most complicated spaceship ever built, with more than 2.5 million parts. Oh my goodness, a lot more. And weighing over 4.5 million pounds at launch. It can carry up to 7 astronauts and 35,000 pounds of cargo, and was designed to be flown again and again. It is in more than 100 missions. The crews of the spaceships Challenger, Columbia, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour have achieved amazing things. They have delivered and repaired communications and weather satellites and transported large sections of the International Space Station. And don't forget the famous Hubble Space Telescope. The shuttle was the only space vehicle large enough to deliver it to space. And when Hubble needed repair, a shuttle crew was sent to fix it. With satellites beaming down images from Hubble, you can view amazing pictures of the universe on your computer screen with just a few clicks. Yes, and Jocelyn loves to look at pictures of space on her iPad. The fleet of shuttles, right, Jocelyn? The fleet of shuttles is scheduled to be retired in 2010. They retired, but I think it's a little later than that. I could be wrong. After delivering the final sections of the International Space Station. This is a picture of the Hubble Space Telescope. Can you see it? Having the opportunity to fly the first flight of something like a space shuttle was the ultimate test flight. I wish I could come back up here whenever I wanted. And that was Aline Collins, the first woman shuttle pilot and commander. And here is a picture of the space shuttle. That is the Discovery, because you could see the name. There is, though, a sad side to this story. 2 shuttle missions have had tragic accidents. I, along with the rest of the world, mourned when all of the astronauts were lost aboard the Challenger in 1986. I saw that when I was in school. They had us watching in an assembly. And Columbia in 2003. We will always remember those who risked their lives to advance our knowledge of science. Krista McAlfee, the first teacher in space, is an everlasting reminder of that sacrifice. I will never forget her inspiring message. I touch the future, I teach, and we continue to learn. The road back to the moon. Our first return missions to the moon will be unmanned probes to preparation for human missions sometime around 2020. Now, it's already been 2020. I'm not sure where we went there. I don't think we've been back to the moon. I think we've sent things to the moon. But that'd be interesting for y'all to do some further research on. Scientists believe we will be able to extract oxygen and water from the moon's craters and harness the sun's rays into electricity. Astronauts will do this work with the help of robots, which will make it possible to have a man based on the moon. Someday, I believe there will be a large lunar station that will be in a permanent orbit around the Earth, up near the moon. This space station will become a stopover for space travelers on their way to the moon and beyond. Just as Lewis and Clark journeyed west into the unknown in 1803 to discover a new world, we will be part of a generation of explorers who will discover new worlds beyond our own. Are you ready? Here is a picture of future moon explorers and the way Buzz Aldrin and the painter Wendell Minor see it in their heads of how things will be. On the moon. And you can see the Earth way in the background. We will establish a new foothold on the moon and new journeys to worlds beyond our own. Using the space station and building our outpost on the moon to prepare for the trip to Mars are critical milestones in Americans' quest to Mars and to other places. First robots, then humans to Mars. Space probes have given us a fascinating look at many of the planets in our solar system. The Cassini-Huygens probe is orbiting Saturn, and the New Horizons probe will fly past Pluto in 2015. It may have done that. Voyager 1 and 2 journeyed to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and Voyager 1 has been traveling in space for more than 30 years. It will be the first probe to go beyond our solar system. Because of probes such as Viking, Pathfinder, and the Mars rovers, I know a great deal about our closest planetary neighbor, which is Mars. We know that Mars has giant volcanoes and giant canyons under its hazy pink sky. We know there was once water on its surface. Where did this water come from, and why is it no longer there? Maybe there were once simple life forms on the mysterious red planet. We will go and find the answers. I foresee man missions to Mars using a reusable spacecraft that will cycle continually between Earth and Mars in permanent orbit. Astronauts will board a taxi spacecraft from Earth to rendezvous with the Aldrin Mars cycler for the trip to the red planet. The cycler's continual trips could make it possible to establish Mars as our second home someday soon, with a permanent human presence. Reminds me of that movie, Total Recall. Mars rover Spirit explores the red planet. Here is one of the rovers on Mars. And the future Aldrin Mars cycler might look something like this. This is the Martini Move Probus and Mars. And this is the vehicle, the lander, and the cycler. I know, huh? The rovers are amazing machines, and they continue to produce amazing results. Mars is there, waiting to be reached. That was said by Buzz Aldrin. Your future in space. You may never become an astronaut, but it doesn't mean you won't be able to visit space. You know, when I was very young, I wanted to be an astronaut, but the math stopped me. You may not think so, but space tourism will likely become a reality in your lifetime. Try this for a special holiday. Take a space tour bus or visit an Earth-orbiting hotel. Imagining new games you can play in zero gravity. Maybe you'll choose to take a trip swinging around the moon to see the Earth rise as you come along the far side, just as Apollo 8's crew did on Christmas Eve in 1968. One day your family may have some amazing vacation choices. Where will you go? Will it be to the seashore on Earth or to the moon's sea of tranquility? My Share Space Foundation is committed to educating young people about careers in science and space travel for private citizens. A space lottery will make it possible for almost anyone to win an adventure award trip on a future tour. Will you perhaps get a winning number? Wouldn't it be fantastic to see the wonders of our home planet from space just as I did? Now, I know we have a new ship. I don't forget what it's called. I haven't been researching too much, and it's been to space many times. It even took William Shatner to space, the oldest man, I think, in space that's not an astronaut, for a little time. It wasn't very long. But we have advanced a lot since this book has been written. So, like I said, it's good to do your further research. In one way, it's already started. Many private citizens around the globe are now working and inventing spacecraft designs for commercial use. Burt Ratton and his team designed and built Spaceship One, the first privately developed pilot craft to enter the realm of space. Who will be the Wright brothers of the 21st century? A new space race is on. Now, I don't know what happened to the Spaceship One. I don't ever heard of it. I think I need to look that up. But here's a picture of it. And here's another picture of probably a little boy getting to see space. The unseeable future. 40 years have come and gone with amazing speed since the day Neil Armstrong and I first put our footprints in that powdery moon dust on July 20th, 1969. 54 years ago and a day. When I got my speech on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. after our historical mission, I said, "We walked on the moon, but the footprints at Tranquility Base belonged to more than the crew of Apollo 11. They were put there by hundreds of thousands of people across the country. And since we came in peace of all mankind, those footprints belong also to all the people of the world. The first step on the moon was a step toward our sister planets and ultimately toward the stars. A small step for a man was a statement of fact. A giant leap for mankind is a hope for the future. It was my hope then, and it will still be my hope today. I remember the words of my father's teacher, Dr. Robert Garden. It is difficult to say what is impossible. For the dream of yesterday is the hope of today, and the reality of tomorrow. I also hope you will learn from history and be inspired, then look to the stars and dare to dream." This is Future Mars Exploring. And I'll share this if you want. You can pause and read it by, zooming in or whatever your device you're using. But this is the timeline of back in 1543 all the way to when this book was written in 2010. Timeline of men and theories and all leading up to getting into space and beyond. And that is Look to the Stars by Buzz Aldrin. Whoever we are, whatever we do, we must never forget that we have the power to make life an extraordinary voyage. Buzz Aldrin. I hope y'all enjoyed that story, Look to the Stars, and I hope y'all stuck with me. And happy anniversary to the moon landing in 1969. We'll see you next week for another story time. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.